Hello and welcome to the third lecture of our semester. This one is called Trends in Drug Use. And as you'll see today, what I'd like to focus on is just that, trends in drug use, the way rates of use of different drugs have changed over the years, especially over recent years. And for the purpose of simplifying things a little bit, we're going to first consider illicit drugs and then to a somewhat lesser extent focus on licit or legal drugs. So with that in mind, what are the trends in drug use that we can observe? Well, before we can answer that question, we actually have to answer a few other more basic questions. One is, how do we determine if someone is using drugs? And relatedly, how do we determine if rates of drug use are changing? Or what the rates of drug use are among a population of people, and indeed if those rates are changing over time. Now, there are different methodologies which we can use to answer these basic questions. Is someone using drugs, or what is a good estimate of the rate of use in a population of people? A common methodology that we use in this area of science, of course, are questionnaires. And these are simply, in most cases, sets of questions about different types of drug use. So questions about different drugs, questions about how frequently a particular person might use different drugs, etc. And as you probably know, if you group together a large set of questionnaires and administer them to a large group of people, you typically call that a survey. So the important idea here is that if we want to measure the rates of drug use among a group of people and maybe indeed estimate what is the typical rate of drug use in a population, we often end up using survey methodology, whereby we are sending out questionnaires to large numbers of people. Now, there are some advantages to this research approach. As compared to other types of research, this is relatively easy to do. I mean, it's relatively easy to construct a questionnaire or to purchase or find from a reputable test-making company a questionnaire that asks about drug use. It's, as compared to interviewing people face-to-face, it's relatively inexpensive and efficient to send out by regular mail or by email questionnaires to large groups of people. But there are also some disadvantages to this research approach. And I should say, as a general idea, in the world of science, in the world of research, there are always advantages and disadvantages. So we can look at just about any type of scientific study, and without trying to be overly pessimistic or critical, we can find some good things about that study, or particularly about the methodology of that study, and some not so good things. So in the case of survey-based research, some of the disadvantages are that this type of research can be biased for some populations, meaning that it doesn't measure very well everyone within a particular population of people. And I'll get to more about what I mean about that in just a few more slides. Another disadvantage to survey-based research is that there may be an issue of bias among questions. That is to say, the questions that we ask about drug use may not be answered in a way that's accurate, and may not be answered in a way that gives us a good measurement of the thing that we want those questions to measure. And again, I'll get to that in a slide or two more. Now, that word bias that I just used is a word that you're of course familiar with. It's a word that exists in our common language, and we use it in different ways. When scientists use the word bias, they usually have a fairly specific meaning in mind. And what that is bias occurs when a measurement systematically misrepresents or mismeasures the thing that it's supposed to measure. So you could imagine, this is silly, I suppose, but let's say you had a ruler, and the ruler was just made poorly such that when it measured 12 inches, it was actually always slightly shy of that. The ruler had been constructed such that it was a little bit too short, even though it was listed or labeled as having 12 inches. That ruler would be systematically biased to under-measure or under-represent or I should say to over measure or over represent things. It would give things a slightly too high a number of inches as compared to what they really were supposed to be. Now, in the case of our questionnaire-based research, what we mean by bias is that when questionnaires are used, they're sometimes biased in that they tend to misrepresent actual drug use. So the types of responses we get from the individual people who answer our questionnaires and the ways in which we aggregate data from those individual responses into a large data set can be biased. Now, bias in research is a complicated phenomenon, and it gets and deserves a lot of attention. For our purpose right now, I want to focus on this idea in a relatively simple way, but in a way that I think is important. So, if we say that our research approach is biased in a particular population, what do we mean? Or why is it the case that our questionnaires, for instance, may be biased in terms of how they measure a population? Well, one thing to acknowledge is that when scientists study populations, and for here, by populations I might mean the population of adults in the United States, or the population of college students in the United States, or the population of high schoolers, et cetera, a large group of people that we can identify in some general way. We can't study all of them. We practically just don't have the money or the time or the resources to send questionnaires to every single person in America, for instance. So what we do is we gather samples of those populations. So instead of interviewing every single person in the country or sending a questionnaire to every single person, we send a questionnaire or we conduct an interview with some small subset, a sample of that overall population. Now, what would be nice is if our sample of the population was a very good representation of the broader population. If our sample was a good microcosm or kind of miniature representation of the broader population. But often that is not the case, and this introduces a form of bias which is technically called sample bias, although that technical definition is perhaps a bit beyond the scope of this class, or sometimes called sample error. So let's imagine here we have the whole population of the United States represented in little colored dots. And let's imagine for our purposes that the red dots represent college students and the blue dots represent people who just aren't in college. And let's imagine that because we can't measure every single person, we instead choose to get a sample of people. So we get, some subset of that whole population. Let's further imagine that because we're working at a university, say you're a professor at a university who studies drug and alcohol use, you gather a sample based on people who are immediately around you. And those people tend to be disproportionately college students. So our sample has more proportionately college students as compared to non-college students than does the total population. When I made this slide, I think I tried to have about an equal number of red and blue dots in the total population, but you can see in my sample there's a disproportionate representation of college students. Why might this introduce bias, or in what way might this bias be evident in the data that we gather from our sample? Well, what if it's the case that college students differ from non-college students in the types of drugs that they use, or in the sort of frequency or intensity with which they use drugs? Let's imagine that college students are more apt to use drugs than non-college students, and that maybe they use different drugs on average than non-college students. That is actually true based on most types of measurements. A common example, of course, is alcohol. People in college tend to drink more and drink more frequently than people not in college, even if we look at folks who are the same age. So let's imagine then that we've gathered a sample of the population of American adults, but our sample is made up of disproportionately college students. The measurements that we make of alcohol use in that sample would be biased in the sense that they would give us the false impression of an exaggerated amount of alcohol use in the overall population. That's an example of bias, specifically sample bias or sample error. So that's one type of bias, and there are others. Another type of bias I mentioned a few slides back is the idea of the bias that can be introduced in terms of the questions that we ask. So independent of this idea of our sample, are there problems of bias that arise based on the types of questions we ask on our surveys or on our questionnaires, which make up our surveys? So why might this happen? Well, scientists have to ask questions, or at least if they're using questionnaire research, they have to ask questions, almost by definition. But people don't always answer questions honestly or accurately. And this may be especially true in the case of drugs. So if you were conducting research, again, let's imagine you're a college professor who studies rates of drug use, and you gather a sample from the broader population, and maybe you know or maybe you don't know that there's some issue of sample bias there. Regardless, for those people, you send out your questionnaires or surveys. They're made up of questionnaires, and the questionnaires are made up of individual questions, and those individual questions ask about drug use. Do you use marijuana? Do you use methamphetamine, etc., etc.? It's possible, perhaps even likely, that people who fill out those questions won't answer accurately. They might particularly tend to underestimate their own drug use, denying drug use or minimizing drug use. For instance, if you ask someone how much alcohol they consume, people typically underreport how much they're really drinking. This, to be a bit technical about it, is an example of measurement bias, where the specific measurement we're administering has a bias built into it, like our ruler, which has been poorly made and thus doesn't truly represent 12 inches when it says 12 inches. This is, again, technically called measurement bias or measurement error, although that precise nomenclature isn't super important for our class. So point is, all research has problems associated with it, including various types of bias. What I'd like you to do now is imagine that you are doing survey-based research on rates of drug use. Try to imagine how you might minimize the bias in your research, minimize the sample bias and minimize the measurement bias. And I'm using the word minimize here deliberately because, of course, no research is perfect. There's no way to make bias disappear or make it equal zero, but there may be some ways to minimize these two types of bias. And I think it's good to practice thinking about how you might do that. So if you're watching this video at home or on your mobile device or whatever, take a few minutes and just imagine how you might construct a survey-based study of rates of drug use so as to minimize sample bias and measurement bias. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about what actual survey-based research on rates of drug use tells us. Well, there are a number of very reputable and long-running surveys that are conducted every year in this country. I'm going to highlight a few of them in this lecture because they are important or famous or both. And one of them is called the Monitoring the Future survey. And this is a survey which is run yearly out of the University of Michigan. It's been going since the mid-1970s up through the present, and it focuses on high school students or junior high / high school students. So every year, approximately 50,000 high school students are sampled in grades 8, 10, and 12, and those students who are sampled from the population of all possible high school students are asked to complete a series of questions about their drug use. And by the way, going back to the practice exercise from the previous slide, ways that the Monitoring the Future survey research tries to minimize sample bias is that they try to randomly sample from the population, meaning that they try to pick at random students from different schools, or at least schools from different areas of the country, so as to not disproportionately have one type of high school student in the sample more so than other types. There are some challenges in doing that. And they also, in an effort to minimize the bias of measurement, they ask students to report on their drug use, but their reports or their responses remain anonymous. So students have some confidence, hopefully, that the types of answers they give to these questions will not be used against them. If they don't fear repercussions for reporting their drug use, maybe they might be willing to be more honest about admitting using drugs if they have been. So the point is, this is a fairly reputable study. It's been going for many years, and it's thought to provide fairly good information about the rates of use of different drugs among young people, especially kind of high school and just about almost college-age students. Now, Monitoring the Future characterizes drug use in different ways, and they use these characterizations, which are common actually in other large survey-based research programs. One is they ask for a variety of different drugs. Have you ever used this drug? For instance, have you ever used cocaine, even just once? Have you ever used tobacco in cigarette form, even just once, etc.? This is sometimes called experimentation. Have you ever experimented with a drug? They ask for the same drugs. Have you used that drug in the last 12 months or in the last year? This is called the 12-month prevalence. This is also sometimes called occasional use. So have you used cocaine in the last 12 months? Have you used nicotine or tobacco in cigarette form in the last 12 months? These all questions are asked again about all the drugs in terms of whether or not people have used the drug in the last 30 days or the last month. This is sometimes called current use. Have you used cocaine in the last month? Have you used cigarettes in the last month? And then finally, for all the drugs, the question is asked based on daily use. Do you daily use cocaine? Do you daily use tobacco in cigarette form, etc.? So the idea here is that for each drug, whether it's LSD or cocaine or tobacco or alcohol, the question is asked 4 times, changing each time the time frame, to get a sense of if someone has experimented with the drug, if they've occasionally used it, if they're kind of roughly speaking a current user of the drug, or if they're indeed a heavy user of the drug. Now, what do all the answers that students give tell us? Well, based on the most recent research, we know that the 12-month prevalence rate of using any illicit drug is approximately 27%. So, a little more than a quarter of high school students, and this is at all, if we average across all of the different ages from 8th, 10th, and 12th grade, about 1 in 4 students will have used an illegal drug within the last year, or at least that's what they'll tell us. If we look at just the high school seniors, that rate gets up to about 50%, or 1 in 2 high school seniors will have reported using an illegal drug at least once within the last year. Now, Monitoring the Future has been going for many years, asking these same questions every year to students since the 1970s, and what that allows us to do is look at the trends in use over time. Have those rates been going up or going down or staying steady? So if we look at that 12-month prevalence rate for any illegal drug, it's interesting to note that overall the rates of drug use, at least based on what people are telling us, have been declining since the 1970s through the 1980s. Then they kind of started to rebound in the 1990s, then they decreased in the early 2000s, and then increased in the somewhat later 2000s. So if you're having a little bit of difficulty visualizing what that looks like, here is a graph that I got from the most recent data up through 2014 from the website for Monitoring the Future. By the way, I'll put a link to that on our website on Blackboard. And you can see here for 8th, 10th, and 12th graders since the 1970s, we only have data on the 12th graders going back to the 1970s, but so over the last decades, the rates of using any illegal drug within the last 12 months kind of peaked in the 1970s, dropped down through the early 1990s, rebounded a bit in the early to mid 90s, and then kind of rose and fell and rose again a little bit in the early to mid 2000s. So it's kind of an interesting pattern of use. That's for any illegal drug. But I want to show you something really interesting. Focus on this graph for just a second. Now look at this graph. This graph is the rate of just using marijuana within the last 12 months. So if you back up your video or just look at your notes, you can see that this is basically the same pattern. That rate rising, falling, then rising and falling for marijuana. Now, if we look at the rates for any drug that is illegal other than marijuana, the graph looks a little bit like this. Kind of interesting. So it really looks like the big changes in drug use, and indeed the most prevalent use of drug, or at least illegal drugs, has been marijuana. If we exclude marijuana from consideration, the graph looks a little bit different. So the important idea here is that marijuana is the most popular illicit drug, not counting alcohol, which of course is illegal for most high school students, at least most people who aren't seniors. And you probably don't need me telling you this, nor do you probably need Monitoring the Future to tell you this, that marijuana is the most popular illicit drug. But it is worth knowing that, or reminding yourself of that, because in Monitoring the Future and in a lot of survey research on rates of drug use, we sometimes consider marijuana separate from other illegal drugs because it is so different. It is so much more frequently used, and the rates of use have changed over time more dramatically for marijuana than they have for other drugs. Generally speaking, most other illegal drugs are much less popular than marijuana, and the rates in their use have not changed nearly as much as the rates for use of marijuana have. So, like I just said, another important idea is that there, generally speaking, is this broad trend. If you look at all drugs, though that trend is most pronounced for marijuana, at least as compared to the other illegal drugs in high school students. A couple more important ideas. Here's an important idea. High school students aren't all using illegal drugs. Perhaps I'm revealing something about my age here, but I can remember when I was in high school and in college, there was, I think, the sense just generally in the culture, or certainly in terms of some of the classes that I took, health classes in high school, or some of the public service announcements that I saw on television, this sense that drugs were a rampant problem among young people. Everyone, all the high schoolers, they're all on drugs. This just isn't the case. The rates of drug use are relatively low for illegal drugs, less than the majority, around 40%-ish of 12th graders have used drugs in the last year or so, a little bit more, a little bit less, depending on if you're going to count marijuana or not, so slightly less than a majority, and that rate is even lower if you exclude marijuana from consideration. And indeed, the rates are low as compared to the rates in the 1970s. So historically speaking, the rates of illegal drug use in high schoolers are not at their lowest point, but fairly low as compared to in the past. Now, that's not to say no one is using drugs. It's a fairly high percentage. It's just not the majority of high school students. And again, the the absolute number of students is still, is not, it's very small. So, the high school students are, as a percentage, not all of them are using drugs. But if you just do the math and multiply 50,000 students times, about 40%, you still get in absolute numbers a fairly large number of students who are taking drugs. And please don't take my comments to indicate that I think drugs are not a problem or can't be a problem for young people. It's just not the case that a majority of young people, at least high school age young people, are using drugs. A related important idea is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence that students are using drugs at younger and younger ages. Again, it's been my impression over the years, or at least I think I've seen over the years, sometimes concerned news reporting or commentary suggesting that kids are using drugs at younger and younger ages. This just doesn't seem to be the case, at least based on the data from the Monitoring the Future survey research. The rates of drug use among 8th graders, at least their self-reported drug use, is pretty low, and it's stayed low over time. We don't see increasing numbers or increasing percentages of 8th graders using drugs over the years. That would, if we did see that, that would indicate that perhaps younger and younger people are trying drugs. That's not what we see in the data that we have from Monitoring the Future. But to be clear, it's not the case that there are no young people using drugs. If we look at the 12-month prevalence for 8th graders using any illicit drug, including marijuana, it's around 14% or so. So again, 15% of all the 8th graders surveyed, that's still a lot of young people. And, the idea of young people using drugs understandably provokes some concern among people, myself included. Again, my point here is it's just simply not the case that we can be alarmist and say, oh no, year after year, more and more young people are using drugs. The rates of drug use among the youngest of the people surveyed, the 8th graders, have stayed fairly low over the years. A related important idea is that the rate of drug use isn't increasing over time, or at least it's not increasing a lot. If we exclude marijuana from consideration, the overall rate of illegal drug use among young people is fairly low and has stayed fairly low over time and has, generally speaking, gone down since the 1970s. So if you want to get into a fight or provoke an interesting argument with your parents or your aunts and uncles, you might point out that the rates of drug use among high school students when they were in high school are probably a lot higher than the rates of drug use among high school students when you were in high school. I don't know if it's worth having a fight about that, but it is an interesting point that is generally speaking true. Relatedly, though, we can say that the rates of marijuana use have varied a lot over time, more than other drugs. The rates of all illegal drugs other than marijuana have not varied that much. The rates of marijuana use have gone up and down quite a bit. Nonetheless, the rates are relatively speaking lower today than they were about 30 years ago or so. And I should say that even though they have increased slightly in recent years. So if we look at high school seniors' marijuana use, we look at the 12-month prevalence. That is, have you used marijuana at all in the last 12 months? In recent years, that rate has gone up a little bit. If we look from the mid-90s to the early 2000s to the mid-2010s, the rate's been creeping up a little bit. And we see a similar pattern, roughly, if we look at the lifetime prevalence. Have you ever tried marijuana? Okay. So hopefully you have a sense of the overall pattern of drug use right now, and perhaps especially about some of the pattern changes or trend changes in marijuana. Next, what I'd like you to do is practice developing a theory. And this may seem like an obvious or very basic definition, but indulge me for a moment. A theory is one of those words that we use in our common language quite often, but when scientists use it, they have a fairly precise definition in mind. So to a scientist, a theory is an explanation of how or why something works. Usually proposing some sort of underlying mechanism or explanation that can help us to understand why it is that a particular phenomenon occurs or how it changes, or etc., etc. So for the purpose of this little exercise, I want you to take a few minutes, or a minute at least, let's say, and develop a theory for the trends in marijuana use. That is, an explanation for why rates of marijuana use have changed over time, at least rates among young people. So why is it the case that marijuana use was relatively high among high school students in the mid-70s? Why did it fall during the early to mid-1980s? Why did it start to rebound again in the 1990s? Why has it kind of gone up and down a little bit in the 2000s? So just think about that. Maybe think about your own experiences, think about the experiences of people you know, and see if you can come up with a theory. Now, like I said, a theory, at least the way scientists use the theory, is an explanation. So you may have come up with multiple explanations for why rates of marijuana use have changed over time. You might have come up with the idea that, well, perhaps changes in popular culture or the media have encouraged changes in marijuana use. Perhaps changes in law and policing and prosecution for drug-related crimes, especially marijuana-related crimes, might have be the explanation for why rates of use have changed. Perhaps you came up with the idea that the availability of the drug has gone up and down, and thus during times in history when marijuana was more available, perhaps people did it more, and maybe during times when it was less available, they did it less. Finally, well, not finally, but in addition, perhaps you have come up with the explanation that people's sense of the riskiness or dangerousness of marijuana has changed over time, and perhaps that has led more or fewer people to use drugs, depending on whether they live in a time when marijuana is generally considered rather safe or a time when marijuana is generally considered rather risky. So again, possible explanations, possible theories for this change in rates of marijuana use. Let's take a look at a few of these possible explanations and see if we can rule some of them out, or indeed rule some of them in. So, first off, popular entertainment, media, music, movies, etc. Is it possible that changes in the way media have portrayed drug use, perhaps especially marijuana use, have encouraged changes in actual patterns of use? Well, I'm old enough to remember college and graduate school. I remember how, if we look at the 30-day prevalence rate of marijuana use, have you used marijuana within the last 30 days? I remember I think it was about 1991, Dr. Dre's album The Chronic came out, The Chronic being a name for a high potency strain of marijuana at the time. It was a very good album if you like hip-hop music. There were a lot of songs about using marijuana, and wouldn't you know it, right after Dre's The Chronic came out, rates of marijuana use began to go up. I remember when I was in graduate school, around 2001, Dr. Dre's follow-up album called Chronic 2001 came out, and it honestly wasn't that good an album. And, there were songs about marijuana use, but as I said, it wasn't that good. So after that, wouldn't you know it, marijuana use went down. So I think we can blame this overall trend on Dr. Dre. Actually, I don't. And although I'm not a huge fan of Dre's music, I do like hip hop, and I'm not trying to blame drug use on rap music in general. Hopefully that came across as a joke. When I do this live in class, people sometimes find that funny. But it is interesting, though. It raises an interesting question. Have rates of drug use been in some way reflected by recent sort of trends in portrayals of drugs or portrayals of marijuana in pop music? This is a really interesting question. It's a little bit tricky to answer, though, because portrayals of marijuana in pop music are not at all a new phenomenon. Indeed, we can go back to the 60s and 70s. We can even go to much earlier in the 20th century for songs about marijuana use or songs about drug use, generally speaking. So have recent changes in sort of music lyrics or pop culture references to marijuana cause changes in drug use, perhaps especially marijuana use? I'm not entirely sure they have. It seems like marijuana has been a part of popular songs for a long time, so it's hard for me to imagine pinning changes in recent trends of or changes in recent prevalence rates of marijuana use on just music, because really the story of marijuana and music is a very long story. But it's something to think about, and I don't know if we can entirely rule it out as a possible explanation or a possible theory. Relatedly, there's actually was an interesting study done by the New York Film Academy just probably a couple of weeks ago from the time I recorded this slide, looking at rates of drug use in movies. And I'm going to link to a short video that the New York Film Academy developed looking at rates at different portrayals of drug use in movies. And what I'd like you to do is watch this video and then see to what extent the evidence presented in this video supports the theory that media portrayals of drugs influence actual uses of drugs, and to what extent the evidence presented in this video does not support that theory. Okay. So continuing on in this vein, we're continuing to evaluate the potential theory that changes in rates of drugs, perhaps especially changes in rates of marijuana, are influenced by changes in the media or music, maybe movies' portrayal of drug use. I would make the argument that images that we see in media about, generally speaking, just about anything, tend to reflect our contemporary concerns. And with regards to drugs, the images that we see about drugs and drug use tend to be a reflection or a mirror on the types of attitudes or concerns that people at the time have about drugs. There seem to be times in history when there have been relatively more positive or permissive attitudes towards drugs, and some of that has been reflected in media, like music, like movies. And there certainly seems to be times in our history when we've had more negative or restrictive attitudes about drugs, and perhaps that is also reflected in our media and our culture. If you watched the video that I linked to and mentioned on the previous slide from the New York Film Academy, they do a nice job of talking about the history of drugs in movies and how that history reflects the type of concerns that people at different points in our general history had about drugs. Here is a graph from the New York Film Academy that looks at the usage of marijuana in the general population and the number of films in which marijuana have appeared in over the last century or so. A couple points about this graph. I actually don't like it very much because it's not clear to me what level of use is being measured, whether they are measuring daily use or occasional use. There's no y-axis on this graph, so it's a little bit difficult to know exactly what's being measured. But nonetheless, you can kind of see that rates of marijuana use have risen up through the 1970s, and then they kind of fell through the 1980s, and then kind of went up until now. Again, I'm not clear at all what the blue line is measuring. It's not percentage because it goes up to 105, but suffice it to say that that general rising and falling pattern is kind of consistent with the monitoring the future data that I showed you previously. And you can see that during that time, rates, the percentage of films that included marijuana as in some way an element of the film has gone up, generally speaking, as well. A question that you might ask about this is, does frequency of marijuana use track or go along with frequency of actual marijuana use? And again, admitting that this is kind of not that great a graph to look at, to me, the evidence seems to be that rates of use were already going up in history before rates of portrayal in movies started to go up. So if anything, I get the impression that the portrayal of marijuana in movies is maybe more of a consequence or a reflection of actual use than it is a cause or a driver of actual use. So again, in the 1960s and 70s, the actual use of marijuana appeared to rise before the use in movies started to rise, which would argue against the theory that media and culture have a causal or driving effect on drug use. In kind of doing a little bit of internet research on this issue, I came across some research which has been published by the Center for Addiction and Substance Abuse. This is a research group out of Columbia University. It's a little bit like the Monitoring the Future group. They survey about 1,000 young people from ages 12 to 17 and ask them about drug use and family life, etc. They haven't been working quite as long as Monitoring the Future, but they work in a similar way. And they've published some research based on the data that they've collected from their surveys. I'm just going to highlight a couple interesting things that I found, and I'll link to this material online so that you can check it out yourself. One of the findings that the Center for Addictions and Substance Abuse has publicized is that people who see, or I should say young people who see R-rated movies are more likely to try marijuana than those who do not. So this, again, might argue that perhaps seeing movies that are R-rated, that might have a greater likelihood of showing drug use in the movies, might encourage young people to then go out and try marijuana themselves. The folks who did this research also published a finding that young people who have sexually active friends are more likely to try a variety of different drugs than young people who do not have sexually active friends. So again, you could kind of look at this and wonder perhaps Is it the case that media images are directly related to use? That seeing images of drugs in the media cause people or encourage people to go out and actually use drugs? That's possible. Pardon me. It's also possible that both drug use and images of drug use in the media are associated with some other variable. So rather than media causing drug use, perhaps media images and drug use are caused by or follow from some other third variable. For instance, perhaps an unstable home life. So it's not clear to me, but at least it seems possible that if you're a young person who is able to go see R movies, which you probably shouldn't because they're supposed to be restricted to people who are older, and if you're a young person who has sexually active friends, it's possible that your home life isn't very stable or that you don't have a lot of supervision from your parents. And this might lead you to both seek out movies and media images of drugs and also seek out your own actual drug use. I'm highlighting this possibility because it's an example of something that comes up a lot in science. Scientists call these other potential causes, like in this case, unstable home life, which I'm kind of tossing out there as a possibility. They call these things third variables, variables which could account for an apparent relationship between your primary variables. Our primary variables are media images of drug use and actual drug use. Do media images of drug use lead to or cause actual drug use? Now that's possible, but it's also possible that both of those variables are themselves caused by a third variable. Again, this is what scientists call these things, third variables, and it can be really tricky to rule them out, to get rid of any possibility that there are third variables when trying to evaluate a theory. And this is especially true for non-experimental research, like research using surveys that ask questions about drug use, patterns of behavior, etc., etc. The distinction between non-experimental and experimental research is something I'll get to a little bit later on in a future lecture, but just for the time being, I want to toss that out there. Okay. So, what's the important point here, or the important idea? The important idea, at least that I would argue, is that the evidence seems to be more consistent with the idea that media images reflect drug use than that they cause drug use. Now, it's certainly possible that people seeing drugs in movies or hearing references to drugs in music might themselves be inspired to use drugs. That might happen for individuals, but generally speaking, it seems like the evidence is more consistent with the idea that culture or media and culture follow actual patterns of drug use than lead actual patterns of drug use. So that first potential theory, do media images of drugs or just general cultural images of drugs, do they lead to drug use? I think we can at least somewhat rule that out. Maybe not entirely, but somewhat. It doesn't seem very convincing to me. Perhaps it does to you, but not to me. Okay, let's move on then. What about changes in law, especially drug policies, the way we prosecute crimes associated with drug use? And maybe we'll focus here especially on federal drug policies. Do they discourage drug use? Perhaps during periods of time in history when drug use was actively discouraged by federal laws or by federal spending on anti-drug programs, maybe that led to declines in drug use, and maybe during the years in which when less money was budgeted for policing of drug crimes and less money was budgeted for anti-drug advertisements and programs, maybe that led to an increase in drug use. This is certainly a possible explanation, a potential theory to explain changes in use of drugs, especially use of marijuana. However, it seems to be the case that money for anti-drug programs and prosecution of drug crimes has, generally speaking, increased steadily since the 1970s, especially during the 1980s and the 1990s. I'm old enough to remember many of these different drug programs over the years. So during the 1980s and during the 1990s, there were Just Say No campaigns and other federally funded programs to discourage drug use. There was a massive increase in the amount of policing for drug crimes during those decades. So it's not, I don't think we can explain changes in rates of use by changes in drug policies, because those policies have, generally speaking, expanded over time and have not tracked along with patterns of use. So a little bit like the case with media, it seems like changes in drug policies follow changing attitudes or changing patterns of use rather than lead off ahead of changing patterns and changing use. A related idea is the rate of arrest for drug crimes. Perhaps if we look at periods of time in which there's a lot of arresting for drug crimes, perhaps that limits the supply of drugs or discourages people from using drugs because they're afraid of being arrested, and perhaps changes in patterns of arrest can explain, at least somewhat, changes in patterns of actual drug use. That seems like a reasonable explanation. It seems like a good potential theory, but I don't think it really holds up based on the available evidence that we have. And particularly in the case of marijuana, the number of arrests made for marijuana has gone up quite steadily, especially during the 1990s. And this was, if you look back or you think back to your graph from the monitoring the future data, this was a period of time in which marijuana use was going up. So it's not the case that arresting more people changed actual patterns of use. It's not the case that by arresting more people for using marijuana, we in any way decrease the supply of marijuana or discourage use, because if we did, we'd expect a decline in marijuana use during the 1990s, not, as we saw, an actual increase. There's actually been a lot of interesting research done on this idea of the effects of rates of arrest for drug crimes, especially for marijuana related crimes. If you're someone who studies in criminal justice, as I know some of you do, you might already be aware of this, but for those of you who aren't, I want to highlight some research that was published. Well, it's a series of studies, one of which was published a couple years ago. A follow-up was published very recently by the American Civil Liberties Union using data from the FBI's arrest records. And so you can see here on this graph the number of arrests for marijuana-related crimes from the 1980s up through the early 2000s per 100,000 people. Or actually, I'm sorry, per million people. And so you can see that the rates of arrests for marijuana went down during the 1980s and then went up quite dramatically during the 1990s and into the 2000s. So again, if it was the case that arresting a lot of people for drug use actually decreased drug use behavior, we'd expect that during the 1990s there would have been a decline in marijuana use instead of, as we know there was, an increase in marijuana use. Another interesting thing that comes up in this research is how the arrests for drug crimes, especially for marijuana crimes, fall disproportionately on people who are minorities, especially people who are Black or African American. And again, as I said before, the American Civil Liberties Union has done a lot of interesting research on this, some of which was published a couple of years ago under the title "The War on Marijuana in Black and White." And again, this was based on data that comes from the National Survey of Drug Use and Health. So that's something I'll talk about in a future lecture. But for now, it's just suffice to say that it is a survey of drug use behaviors, and also data from the FBI on rates of arrest for marijuana crimes. And to highlight a couple of the elements of this research that I thought were interesting, we can say that marijuana accounts for about 50% of all drug arrests. So if we look across all people arrested for all drug crimes, about half of those folks are arrested for marijuana, and about half of those people arrested for marijuana are arrested for possession. That is to say, not for selling or trafficking, but merely for possessing the drug. What's also striking about this research is that that folks who are Black or African American are much more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than people who are white. So again, if we think about drug arrests for drug crimes, about half of all people arrested for drug crimes are arrested for marijuana, and about half of those people are arrested merely for possessing the drug, not for selling the drug. And when we look at those people who are arrested for possession, they're much more likely to be Black than they are to be white. This is a graph from that study by the American Civil Liberties Union, and this is data based on the 12-month prevalence of marijuana use for folks who are Black or African American and the folks who are white. And I should point out here that this is not just among young people, this is among people of all ages from the National Survey of Drug Use and Health. And what we can see here, or at least what I hope you can see here, is that the rates of marijuana use among Black and white people are pretty similar. For the most part, although those bars for each year are not always at exactly the same level, for most years they are close enough that there's not a significant difference between them. What a statistician or a researcher would say is a significant difference. So generally speaking, folks who are white report, at least on national surveys, report about as frequent use of marijuana as folks who are Black in almost any year that we've ever measured that. And now here is a graph for those same years looking at the arrest rates for different marijuana possession. And I think what is obvious is that the arrest rates for Black people are much higher than those for white people, and also you might notice that the arrest rates for Black folks have generally risen over the years, whereas for white people they've stayed essentially steady and rather low. So this is, I think striking. It's disturbing to many people. I think it's disturbing to me that we seem to have a criminal justice system that tends to prosecute the crime of marijuana possession much more vigorously against folks who are Black or African American than folks who are white. So Black people, as I said, just generally speaking, more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than folks who are white, and that is based on national survey data from around the country. Interestingly, the American Civil Liberties Union chapter in Minnesota recently conducted a similar analysis of data based just on arrest rates in the city of Minneapolis. So to bring this to kind of a local focus, and looking at more or less the same time period, recent 2000s, we see a similar pattern occurring more or less in our home area, certainly in the area of Minneapolis. Here is a graph based on those rates of arrest in Minneapolis for just the last sort of decade or so, and you can see a very similar pattern. That is, when we look at arrest for marijuana possession, the arrest rate for folks who are white or are Caucasian much lower than folks who are Black or African American. The important idea here is that drug arrests, at least arrests for possession, don't seem to discourage use. If they did, then we would expect that those rates of arrest would track along with rates of actual use. That as rates of arrest went up, rates of use would go down, but that's not the case. It's also, and I think very important to acknowledge, that the arrests for drugs, in this case marijuana, but it's actually true for pretty much all the drugs, tend to disproportionately affect folks who are minorities, especially folks who are Black or African American. I think that's a significant, it should be a significant concern for us as a society. We have a war on drugs, but it is a war that unfairly, in my judgment, targets a portion of our population, a minority portion of our population. And as a bit of a preview for future lectures, I'm going to return to this idea that a lot of our attitudes about drugs and a lot of the way we police and kind of prosecute drug use tends to be informed by our attitudes about and our prejudices about different racial or ethnic groups, and tends to affect disproportionately different racial and ethnic groups. So anyway, to bring this back to focus, we're thinking, why have marijuana use rates changed over time? Why have there been trends in marijuana use that have risen and fallen over the years? One potential explanation is sort of pop culture and media. It's unclear, but it seems like pop culture and media perhaps serves more as an effect or a reflection of use than the cause of use. Another potential explanation could be federal funding for anti-drug programs and federal funding for arrest and prosecution of drug crimes. that doesn't seem to work either. It seems more likely that these rates of arrest have been generally high over the years and have not decreased drug supply or drug use. Another potential explanation or another theory you might have or you might have thought of is that availability is causally related to patterns of drug use. And this makes sense, of course. If drugs are more available, maybe people are more likely to use them. During periods of time in history when drugs are less available, maybe people just couldn't get them even if they wanted to use them. Here again, though, I think if we look at the data we have, this is data from the Monitoring the Future study, and here we're looking at 12th graders, and we're looking at 30-day prevalence of marijuana use. We're looking at people who are relatively regular marijuana users, because they're saying they've used at least within the last 30 days. Here it seems like availability is fairly unrelated to use. So in just about any year that Monitoring the Future has been done, they've asked 12th graders and other folks, but 12th graders about their use of marijuana. They've also asked them about their perceived availability of marijuana. How available is marijuana to you? Is it something that you could get if you wanted it? And throughout time, the perceived availability of marijuana has been quite high, almost 100%. At least north of 80% of high school seniors say that marijuana is available to them. But you can see that the actual use of marijuana by those same 12th graders has risen and fallen over time. So there's a little bit of a concordance between these graphs, but it's not very close. It's not the case that there were periods of years during the 80s when availability went down and use went down, and then availability went up in the 90s and use went up in the 90s. That blue graph for availability is relatively steady. That kind of green or turquoise graph for use is quite variable. So it seems to me, at least, that that availability is unrelated or not closely related to actual use of this drug. So we've ruled out, at least I think provisionally ruled out, media and culture. We've ruled out, I think fairly conclusively, arrests and prosecution for drugs. We seem to have ruled out, I think, availability. What other reasons or what other theories could we have for changing rates of drug use? The important idea here is that availability doesn't seem to be closely related to drug use. Again, a bit of a repeat here, but obviously if a drug was totally unavailable, then no one could use it, but it's pretty much impossible to remove all drugs, or in this case to remove marijuana entirely. So we've ruled out these other potential explanations, these other theories. What do we have? Well, one thing that we haven't addressed yet is risk. And it's possible that when people see a drug as risky, they're less likely to use it. When they see a drug as relatively safe or not risky, maybe they're more likely to use it. And I think this has some obvious, perhaps even just intuitive sense. Here, if we look at the data on actual use, and we look at the data on people's perception of the risk of use for marijuana, we see a really interesting pattern. So here again, from Monitoring the Future, is 12th graders' 30-day prevalence of marijuana use. We're looking at 12th graders who report fairly current use of marijuana. They're using it within the last month. They're probably people who use marijuana from time to time, regular users. If we look at their rate of use and we look at their perceived risk of use, we see a pattern that is roughly inverse. So you can see during the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the riskiness of marijuana, or the perceived riskiness, how risky people thought the drug was, began to rise. And it was during those years that the actual use of the drug began to go down. Then during the 1990s, kind of the early 1990s, the riskiness of marijuana kind of dipped. People, generally speaking, started to see marijuana as less risky to use, and the actual use of the drug began to rise. So these things are inverse of each other. They're almost like mirror images of each other. And moreover, if you really squint at the graph, you can almost imagine that there's kind of a lag such that perceived risk rising and then falling leads or occurs first, and actual use falling and then rising in mirror image follows slightly. Although again, you'd need some clever time series statistics to really prove that point, but it's at least tempting to think that perceived riskiness, how risky folks, or at least in this case 12th graders, think marijuana is, changes, and that changes in perceived risk have some sort of causal relationship with changes in actual use of marijuana. Here's some of the same research. It's a different graph, but from the same source, monitoring the future. Here we're looking at the 12-month prevalence of marijuana. This is, have you tried marijuana in the last 12 months, not just within the last 30 days. And here you just see a generally similar pattern. That pattern sort of looks like as perceived risk goes up, actual use goes down, and as perceived risk goes down, actual use goes up. Again, we could argue a little bit about which is the leader and which is the follower of those two trends, but at the very least, they seem inversely related. So the important point here, like I just said, is that perception of risk and actual use of this drug have a relationship to each other. To be technical about it, we could say that they're correlated with each other, or to be even more technical, we could say that they are negatively correlated with each other, or inversely correlated with each other. As one goes up, the other goes down. Still, we could argue about which is the cause. Is it the case that people change their attitude or their mind about the riskiness of a drug and then they start to use it? Or is it the case that people start using a drug and then they change their mind about the attitude or riskiness of the drug? Which one of these two variables is the cause and which one is the effect? We don't necessarily know. Of course, we don't also know if there's a third variable there which might be influencing both perceived risk and actual use. We're not entirely clear here, but there's some interesting evidence to look at. Another important idea to make is that this is a non-experimental study, and to be clear, when I say non-experimental study, we mean research where we're just looking at correlations between variables. And when we do this type of research, it's often difficult to identify conclusively causes and effects. In fact, if you've taken a statistics class, or if you've taken perhaps just another science class, you may have already encountered the phrase correlation does not equal causation. This is a phrase that we throw around to encourage people to think carefully about variables that are correlated. It's tempting to think that if two variables are correlated, one of them's the cause and one is the effect. It may be the case that there's a causal relationship between between two variables that are correlated, but it's often not entirely clear which is the cause and which is the effect. So for the purpose of this discussion of risk of use and actual use, there seems to be a correlation here. I'm tempted to think that probably perceived risk is more of the cause and actual use is more of the effect, but I wouldn't stake my career on that. Hopefully, though, you can at least see that as a somewhat compelling piece of evidence, certainly more compelling than some of the other potential theories that we've looked at. So we're kind of left here with some more important ideas. Why have rates changed? Use is probably related to many factors. Use of marijuana, use of drugs generally. Things like attitudes towards them seem to be important, especially expectations about negative experiences and expectations about positive experiences. If you think about the example of cigarette smoking, certainly in my lifetime, the attitudes about the riskiness of cigarettes and tobacco generally, but especially cigarettes, have changed a lot. And I think it's undeniably the case that as people began to see tobacco use and cigarette use especially as more risky, associated with more negative experiences, and as less positive, associated with fewer positive experiences, behaviors followed. So changes in attitudes in the case of tobacco seem to have led to changes in behavior. So people smoke much less frequently today than they did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or more. I think a lot of that is due to changes in attitudes like perceived riskiness of that behavior. I suspect a very similar phenomenon has occurred with marijuana, which is that as people have seen the drug as relatively less risky to use, their actual patterns of use have changed accordingly. So Hopefully this has been kind of an interesting discussion for you to think through. The goal was partly to introduce you to some basic research on rates of drug use, especially rates of marijuana use, but also to get you thinking a little bit about some of the basic skills and activities of scientists, particularly making and evaluating theories. And if you followed along, I hope you found it interesting. As a preview, in the next lecture, we're just going to do more of the same. I'm going to talk about more trends in drug use, not just focusing on young people, but also focusing on other age groups, including focusing on college students, and there even more so focusing on alcohol. And you probably don't need me to tell you this, but alcohol use is fairly common among college students, and so a lot of research, unsurprisingly, has been done to look at how those rates of alcohol use have changed over time among college students and what variables could be offered as potential explanations for those changes in use. So next time will be more of the same, but I hope it will be interesting for you. I think it will probably be. For the time now, though, thanks for your attention. Perhaps if you're watching this video at home, take a break, do something relaxing, let your mind rest, and then when you're ready, come back for the next video, which will be available, if not now, then very, very soon. So thanks so much, guys. Bye-bye.